Tonight, Supreme Court reform.
Only Supreme Court justices refuse to allow their conduct to be investigated or reviewed.
Congress calls for a code of ethics for the High Court as Republicans push back.
They aren't getting their way, so they want to change the rules.
Plus, on a mission from God, the Pope hints at a secret peace plan underway in Ukraine. And a historic speech.
The prophet Isaiah predicted a brighter future to come.
The first address to the Knesset in Israel by a U.S. House Speaker in a quarter century. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Congress targets the Supreme Court. Good evening, I'm Jenna Browder.
Welcome to Faith Nation. From our studio in Washington, I'm John Jessup. Well, a showdown between the Senate and the Supreme Court over ethics, but only one party even bothered to show up. Senate Democrats holding a hearing over why the High Court isn't bound by a code of ethics commonplace among lower courts and elected officials.
It follows reporting on undisclosed real estate deals by two justices and Chief Justice John Roberts' refusal to testify. Caitlin Burke is following the developments and has tonight's top story. Caitlin?
In the past month, reports involving two justices opened the door to these questions. A ProPublica investigation found a Republican billionaire paying for luxury vacations for Justice Clarence Thomas over the last 2 decades. He also bought real estate from Thomas in Georgia. Neither were disclosed. Then last week, a Politico report that Justice Neil Gorsuch didn't disclose he sold property to the head of a law firm with multiple cases before the Supreme Court. Democrat lawmakers call these ethical violations and want legislation passed to hold justices accountable.
Because the court will not act, Congress must.
During Tuesday's Senate Judiciary hearing, Democrats pointed out that the High Court is the only federal court without a formal structure of ethics.
Justices read the ethics rules in unique and eccentric ways, and when they're caught out of bounds, they refuse to allow any investigation of the facts.
While Republicans agree for the need of greater transparency from the High Court, they accuse Democrats of attempting to delegitimize the justices rather than bring about reform.
The danger isn't that rogue justices are operating without ethics. It's that Democrats aren't winning every fight, and they find that reality intolerable.
If you want to talk about making the court a better institution, I'll be glad to work with you in that regard. If you want to talk about destroying the court, count me out.
Chief Justice John Roberts declined an invitation to testify, citing concerns about separation of powers and suggesting it could threaten the independence of the judiciary.
The constitutional separation of powers means that no branch of the federal government can dictate how another should govern itself.
Answering legitimate questions from the people's elected representatives is one of the checks and balances that helps preserve the separation of powers.
In response to the hearing, all 9 justices released a joint statement explaining their commitment to ethics principles while dismissing calls for oversight. Still, Democrats have introduced several bills that would require the Supreme Court to adopt an ethical code, consequences for violating it, and recusal guidelines. Expert witnesses, however, disagree on whether Congress has the power to do so, given the Constitution deems the judicial and legislative branches as co-equal.
It is the Supreme Court, not the Congress, that has the prerogative under our constitutional structure to decide whether to adopt a code of conduct that governs themselves.
For over 230 years, and for as long as the Supreme Court has existed, Congress has regulated vital aspects of its operation, including its ethical obligations.
It's unlikely any of the proposed bills will make it through a divided Congress. But as one expert witness pointed out, even if a law did pass with bipartisan support, Congress can't compel the Supreme Court to abide by it. John, Jenna?
All right, Caitlin Burke, thank you very much. And here with us now is Thomas Chipping, Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Thomas, welcome. So let's start there with the question of authority. Even if Congress were to impose ethics rules on the High Court, couldn't the Supreme Court just turn around and deem them unconstitutional?
Well, they could, but the real question is the distinction between Congress imposing some ethics rules and Congress requiring the Supreme Court to do so. That may seem like a kind of a trivial distinction to many, but it is a very important constitutional distinction. One thing that the Democrats on the committee today did not acknowledge was that they had asked for the views of one of their favorite liberal law professors, Larry Tribe from Harvard Law School. And in his letter, he said Congress does have, in his opinion, authority to impose some rules, but he flatly rejected as a violation of the separation of powers, Congress requiring the Supreme Court to do so. And that's what all three current Democratic bills would do. Congress does not have the authority to do that.
Thomas, notwithstanding the separations of power argument, only a quarter of the American public has confidence in the Supreme Court, according to recent Gallup polls. That's down some 40% from a couple years ago. How does that factor into the equation when it comes to the need for greater reform and transparency?
Well, of course, a poll like that by itself, which is so general, doesn't give any indication as to why people have confidence or why they lack confidence. Confidence in the Supreme Court can be undermined or manipulated as well. The left and Democrats in Congress have had a relentless campaign criticizing the current Supreme Court as partisan, unethical, ideological. You had Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Senate leader, on the steps of the Supreme Court a few years ago, threatening individual justices if they didn't rule the way he wanted. So that erodes confidence as well. This isn't just an organic, people just know everything about the judicial system, they observe what's going on, and then they have an opinion. No, people's confidence and perception of the Supreme Court is easily manipulated, and that's part of this campaign.
If I may interject, though, lower courts have these code of ethics standards, so why not the Supreme Court?
Well, Congress created the lower courts, and so Congress has much more authority to regulate them. The Constitution, however, created the Supreme Court. So Congress's authority over the Supreme Court is not the same as it is over the lower courts. And in fact, the code of judicial conduct that the lower court judges follow is not mandatory. It's only guidance. And the Supreme Court justices use the same code for the same guidance. So, none of those things were mentioned by the Democrats today, but there is a fundamental difference in terms of Congress's authority over the lower courts and over the Supreme Court.
Thomas, in the time we have left, today marks the one-year anniversary of the Dobbs leak, revealing the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe. Justice Alito said over the weekend he had a pretty good idea of who it was, and the leak made the justices what he called targets of assassination. A quick final thought.
Well, I think he's right. The leak was clearly by someone who wanted to manipulate the court's opinion. It clearly didn't work. But it certainly added to what I was talking about before, and that is the degrading view of and perception by the public, and that results in some very, very dangerous consequences.
All right, Thomas Chipping of the Heritage Foundation, thank you so much for your time and insights tonight.
Thank you.
In other news tonight, the largest international law enforcement operation in history, targeting fentanyl and opioid traffickers on the dark web. Today, the DOJ said nearly 300 criminals were arrested in a years-long, three-continent operation.
Our message to criminals on the dark web is this: you can try to hide in the furthest reaches of the internet, but the Justice Department will find you and hold you accountable for your crimes.
Operation Spectre seized more than 850 kilograms of illegal narcotics off the streets, including 64 kilos of fentanyl or fentanyl-laced drugs intended to be sold on the dark net. 153 arrests alone were made in the U.S.
A major development on the southern border tonight. The White House planning to send 1,500 troops ahead of a possible surge of migrants, anticipated as the result of the termination of Title 42 pandemic-era restrictions put in place under former President Trump. The Biden administration officials say the troops would not engage in law enforcement. Instead, they'd supplement Customs and Border Patrol protection by focusing on administrative tasks to free up CBP agents for field work. Well, joining us now is Nathan Gonzalez, editor and publisher of Inside Elections and a Faith Nation contributor. Welcome to you, Nathan. So border officials and the White House are expecting a major surge ahead of the expiration of Title 42. Nathan, can you address the calculation behind President Biden's decision to send troops to the border?
Well, it's an admission that the status quo, or at least what the expected status quo after the policy is removed, will be, and that the border needs help. That there's more support needed. So it's sort of, I think, it boils down to what are the results, right? Do these troops and this support, does it mean that there will be fewer people that are coming into the country illegally, or is it continued chaos, or at least perceived chaos at the border? This is going to be one of the top campaign issues that Republicans will bring up under the larger security umbrella. But we have to see how it plays out and if it's a deterrent or not for those who think that it's going to be easier to get across the border here in a couple weeks.
On the nation's debt limit, Nathan, the Treasury Secretary issued a dire warning yesterday, moving up the default deadline to June 1st. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, of course, and the GOP-led House sent a plan to the Senate last week, putting the onus now on Democrats and President Biden. Here's Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer.
McCarthy is giving us two terrible options: either default on the debt or default on our country, with steep, severe, devastating cuts to things like law enforcement, veterans, families, teachers, kids, even cancer research. The only real option that does not hurt the American people is a clean, bipartisan bill to avert default.
So you heard him there. Schumer wants a clean debt ceiling lift. Republicans say no debt limit increase without spending cuts. And Nathan, it all comes ahead of an upcoming meeting at the White House with congressional leaders from both parties. Where do you think this will land?
Well, there needs to be a compromise, and I'm not sure our two parties are capable of it. One of the main challenges is that I think the two parties are trying to solve two different issues. I think Democrats are focused on that potential default. I think Republicans are focused on reducing spending in government. Those can both be, noble goals, but they're two very different things when we talk about what is the solution to get there. And so I think it's a crisis. And I think one of the things that's holding a compromise back is that we've had this discussion before, and we've had government shutdowns, and the country has moved on. But a government shutdown and potentially defaulting, kind of as a country on our credit are two different things. But there isn't the fear of a default that I think is necessary to create a compromise.
David, I'm sorry, I'm mixing up my days here. Nathan, to 2024, Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, often described as a potential presidential candidate, is officially not running. He gave a terse no when asked about a White House bid Monday. That doesn't rule out, though, a bid for the U.S. Senate, does it?
No. I mean, Senator Tim Kaine is up for election, and I know that there are Republicans who would love for the governor to take on that race. But when I see politicians make these statements, I kind of laugh, because politicians often make these statements up until the point where they change their mind. And depending on how the Republican presidential primary plays out, it could be, he could say, well, circumstances have changed, and make a different decision. So this is the stance he's at now. But what viewers may not realize is that a lot of Youngkin's team that helped him get elected are right now working for Governor DeSantis, at least on the super PAC side, to help Governor DeSantis. So if Youngkin were to jump in now, he would be doing it without the team that helped him win that governorship.
Oh, that's interesting. All right, Nathan Gonzalez, we're out of time for this evening, but always good to have you. Thank you so much. Nathan Gonzalez with Inside Elections.
Thanks, Nathan.
Good to see you guys.
Coming up, a mission from on high. The Vatican's secret plan to help Ukrainian children of the war.
Welcome back. The war in Ukraine has left at least 20,000 dead this year, according to the White House. The United Nations reports nearly 9,000 civilians have been killed, perhaps the most vulnerable, children. That's why the Vatican is stepping in to help.
Io sono disposto a fare tutto quello che si deve fare. Anche adesso è in corso.
And the Pope says while the war is still raging, the Vatican is doing what it can to reunite families.
Well, Chuck Colton is a CBN contributor. He joins us now. Chuck, you've been in and out of Ukraine since the Russian invasion in February of 2022. In what ways have you seen the children of Ukraine being affected? Chuck, can you hear us?
How about that?
There you are.
Okay, I think we have you.
Yep. So in what ways have you seen Ukrainian children affected?
Well, it's unbelievable how they've been affected. You can imagine having the uncertainty of not knowing whether or not your house is going to blow up as these missiles continue to rain down around the country, especially in the areas along the front lines. Children, they're incredibly resilient, but that doesn't change the fact that they are being tremendously affected. They haven't been able to go to school. They haven't been able to get health care. They haven't been able to have any kind of a social life. You imagine living your life underground in bunkers and what that would do to you. So yes, of course it has. There have been hundreds and hundreds of children killed, many more thousands that have been wounded by these shells and missiles that have been sent in by Russia on an almost daily basis. So it's been really terrible for them, and not to mention the 19,000 or so children who have been kidnapped by Russia and taken into Russia and forcibly adopted to families against their will, even though they're not orphans.
Yeah. And brainwash, we should add, into the Russian way of thinking. You know, Chuck, you've been there putting yourself in harm's way. What has most impacted you?
Well, I mean, it's really, really difficult to see just the senselessness of it. And even more than what's affected me. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years and I'm pretty inured to it. But I took my family, I took my wife and my daughter to Kyiv with me for a couple months last year. And my daughter got to go out and visit the front lines with me a couple times. And I just remember everywhere we went, she would just look at the devastation and say, it's so senseless. That why? I mean, for one man's ego is all it is. And they've literally tried to destroy that entire country. But it is very heartening to see how the Ukrainian people have pulled together. And now, of course, the Pope is talking about this secret mission to try to come up with a peace plan. That's going to be very difficult because the two sides have mutually exclusive views on what it will take to achieve peace. Russia essentially is not going to allow any kind of peace unless A, they completely collapse, or B, they get to keep what they've taken already at a minimum. And the Ukrainians are saying there's nothing doing. Not only are we going to take back everything that the Russians have taken, but we're also going to take back the Crimea, which they've had for now about 9 years.
All right, Chuck Holton, it's so good to have you on this evening. Thank you so much for joining us, Chuck.
Thanks, Chuck.
Stay safe.
When we come back, a history-making speech by an American politician making waves in the Holy Land. Well, Jenna, a little bit of history made this week. For the first time in 25 years, the American Speaker of the United States House of Representatives addressed Israel's parliament, the Knesset.
That's right. Speaker Kevin McCarthy reaffirmed the deep bond between Israel and the United States and also made clear the U.S. position on the threat from Iran. Chris Mitchell brings us the story from Jerusalem.
Speaker Kevin McCarthy came at the invitation of Israel's Speaker of the Knesset, Amir Ohana. Together, they reviewed an honor guard and laid a wreath in memory of the fallen soldier. Beyond the ceremonies here at the Knesset, Speaker McCarthy reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to prevent the Islamic Republic of Iran from becoming a nuclear power.
As we stand shoulder to shoulder against Iran's regional aggression, we must always remain resolute in our commitment that Iran will never acquire a nuclear weapon.
McCarthy's speech came just days after Israel celebrated their 70th anniversary, and he celebrated how the nation's birth fulfilled biblical prophecy.
The prophet Isaiah predicted a brighter future to come. Inspired by God, he shared this command: arise, shine, thy light to come. My friends, today, 75 years after declaring independence, Israelites shine brighter than ever before. Ladies and gentlemen, Israel's rebirth is nothing less than a modern miracle, and I thank you for it.
McCarthy said the U.S. House of Representatives recently passed a bipartisan resolution celebrating both the anniversary and the Abraham Accords. while also warning the #1 threat to Israel and those accords is Iran. During a news conference following his speech, CBN News asked the speaker about U.S. military cooperation with Israel against Iran.
You made a commitment in your speech that the U.S. will not allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. Right now, there's a sense here in Israel sometimes they may have to go it alone. Would you recommend to the administration that would join Israel militarily if they have to?
An armed nuclear Iran is not a safe place to be for the world. And I think it's very clear with the people behind me as well. We will never stand to allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon.
During this visit, McCarthy also met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He told a Hebrew publication that if President Biden doesn't invite Netanyahu to Washington, he will. Former Israeli ambassador to the UN and Knesset member Danny Danon told CBN News the threat of Iran is a major reason Netanyahu needs to be at the White House.
The American people should be worried about nuclear Iran the same way we are worried about it. It's a global effort, and I expect that President Biden will invite Prime Minister Netanyahu to the White House to discuss those issues. It must happen ASAP.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, the Knesset, Jerusalem.
Still ahead, delivering justice with a side of pizza. Next on Faith Nation. Finally tonight, a pizza delivery man in Pennsylvania went above and beyond the call of duty, stopping a suspect in his tracks.
Delivery driver Tyler Morrell was making a drop when he noticed a man being chased by police outside a home. A doorbell camera caught Morrell's heroic response when he jumped into action and tripped the fleeing suspect, all while safely balancing the pizza. Police were able to arrest the suspect, praising Morrell for his quick thinking. The hero did note also that the cheese was unharmed and the homeowner was able to enjoy a freshly delivered pizza. Wow, just the ability to balance and catch a suspect.
I appreciate somebody stepping up and saying, no, we're not going to allow this.
Yeah, I guess you don't need a cape to be a hero these days.
Yeah. All right, that's going to do it for Faith Nation tonight.
Thanks so much for watching. We hope you have a great night, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow.